All right. Hi, Stacy and Michael. You guys are the first ones in. Oh, here we go. A bunch of other people are joining. We'll give everyone a couple minutes to kind of join in, and then we'll get started. We were just talking about the weather. We just learned a brand new revenue management term called the real feel. What does that tell us, Brian?
It tells us the heat index is what it really is. It's I think AccuWeather is the one who uses it, but yeah, that's what I look at like whenever I'm like, all right, can I walk outside or am I going to melt once I get out there?
Yeah, you got to put like little like floating tents on the water. It's like avoid the real feel with our new tent B&Bs.
We actually, one of the guys at work, he's got an ice pack vest that he will wear. That he's put ice packs in it. I mean, his is for health, health reasons that he needs it. But it legitimately, he puts it on. He's like, man, it makes it a lot more bearable.
It's actually brilliant.
It is.
Yeah. I don't live in an area where I need to worry about that, but that seems like a really good, like, that's like a product that's not expensive to create that you can sell really easily, like on the street.
Mm-hmm.
You could even make them disposable so you can sell them every day. Kind of like those ponchos, reverse poncho.
Just the smack to make cold ice packs, the ones where you smack it and it gets cold.
Yeah. So everyone who's coming in, we really appreciate you joining us today. Why don't you tell us where you're from in the chat? We'd love to know where people are visiting. I'm always surprised when I see people in like, Lithuania. It's like midnight or something. They're burning the midnight oil. Montreal, awesome. Park City. Hey, Heather. Hey, Henry. Good to see you guys. Oh, Pakistan. All over. Like, what time is it in Pakistan? Legitimately midnight.
Tomorrow for sure.
Yeah. How's it going, everyone? Really appreciate having you here. I'm going to give it like 2 more minutes just to let some people come in. Just as a reminder, the session is recorded. For all the people who ask me if it's recorded because they won't be here, they can't hear that, but it is. And we'll be hosting this on our YouTube. If you haven't been to the Wheelhouse YouTube, we have a bunch of great stuff. Obviously some Wheelhouse stuff, but all of the revenue management roundtables from this year are hosted up there, as well as some other webinars and interesting things as well. So feel free to check that out. I don't know if anyone from my team is here, but if you are, you should put it in the chat. I guess I can do it. Hey, Randy, I see you in here too. How's it going? All right. So why don't we just kind of jump in today? Really excited for a great revenue management conversation. Put together a really good group of folks. Some of these folks you probably recognize. And so we have some new ones. So why don't we start with some introductions? Jordan, would you like to start us out today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Jordan Block. I've been in pricing for an extremely long time. So I've priced everything from insurance to groceries and computer chips and water balloons. About 8 years ago, I switched to the STR space, started doing revenue management. Since then, I've worked for a couple companies, started the revenue management program at Verbo, as well as recently relaunched my consultancy, Red Party Consulting.
Awesome. And Rebecca?
Hey, my name is Rebecca. I am with Reven Research. We're a revenue management consultant firm. We've got partners in pretty much every market in the US. And then we now are got some international clients. So it's really fun to have a very different perspective bringing to the conversation today.
Awesome. Thanks, Rebecca. And Javier.
Hi, I'm Javier. I'm with Angel Host. I'm part of the revenue management team there. We basically help property managers with everything that is off-site. So like guest services, revenue management, listing optimization, stuff like that. I've been in the industry for about 6 years now, and we manage properties in about 11 countries, main markets being Mexico, Southeast Florida, and we have a lot of properties in the Caribbean as well, in Turks and Caicos and Barbados. So it's a pretty diverse portfolio.
Awesome. Pleasure to have you here. And Brian.
I'm Bryant, Bryant Loy. I work for Brett Robinson down here in the Gulf Shores, Orange Beach area of Alabama. I've been working in revenue management for about 7 years now. Before that, I was working in some insurance analytics and things like that, and very excited to be here. Good to see everybody again.
Awesome. Thanks, Bryant. And my name is John DeRelay. I'm the head of revenue management at Wheelhouse. Have been in the revenue management STR game for about 10 years now. Talked to folks all over, and really excited to have another great conversation about revenue. So why don't we just jump in here? We're kind of towards the end of the summer, which for a lot of people is high season. Been a pretty interesting year, I'm sure. Let's go around the horn and ask, kind of a couple multi-part question. You can pick whatever you want. What were you guys expecting coming into summer, maybe in January, and then also separately in May, April, May? And then what did summer end up looking like for your guys' team? And why don't we start with Bryant, and then we can kind of just pop in, or I'll call on someone.
Yeah, so we came into the year and kind of finished last year with really, really high expectations. We had great pacing. We saw great demand. Things were really feeling like we were going to get back to somewhere between the 21 high and the 22, which was also very good. Kind of somewhere in between those two. And through about mid-February, that's about where everything was. And then sometime around that second rate increase out there by the Fed and the banks collapsing and everything else, the proverbial tap just kind of shut off a little bit for us. And we had to kind of readjust some of our expectations from that point. It took us a little bit to determine, is this just a kind of normal fluctuation, or is this kind of the new expectation for the year? So by May, we were at the point where we had pretty well understood, okay, we're not going to see 21 or 22 numbers this year. We're going to have to make some adjustments. We're going to have to change the way we're spending on our paid spend, change the way we're hitting our marketing strategy, and change the way that we're pricing to really go out there and get a higher share of the market's potential guests. And so that's kind of how they shifted. Where we ended up finishing was we had great occupancy across the summer. We ended up with really fantastic occupancy across June and July, and the latter half of May. First couple of weeks of August are pacing pretty well for us too. But we haven't been able to charge those rates that we thought we were going to be able to get early in the year. We had to really adjust the strategy and drop some things to make that happen.
Perfect. Who'd like to jump in next?
Sure, I can. To kind of go off of that is really similar to what Brian was saying, what I was seeing in a lot of the Panhandle. We saw a shift happening. And so we had some clients that were ready to lean into the data, that were really ready to make those adjustments. And then we kind of had another group of clients that were like, no, you're just the consultant. We know our market. We feel like these rates can hold high. And it really came down to the final, within that 30 days, then we're having those conversations of, now what? Like, you're not occupied for your bread and butter months. You're not, it's very hard to book an 8-bedroom home within, 2 weeks. It's not the game I like to play with those larger homes. With condos, it's a little bit easier to kind of pick up those last minute weekend reservations and kind of build in occupancy. But when you're talking in those larger homes with a lot more amenities, a lot more moving parts, higher ADR, they got hit pretty hard with holding those rates higher for longer, hoping that it was going to play out. The Panhandle, I think for a lot of people, and especially Destin 38, had a better June than July, which that's completely unheard of. Up until the very last day in July, we were seeing bookings kind of come in. So it's been interesting to see how important making data-driven decisions has been this year. I mean, that's something that we all talk about, but the proof is in all markets, especially markets that aren't highly sought after summer destinations. But it's like if their ADRs were right, they were getting occupancy. So it really is going back to the fundamentals, and we've talked a lot about that even on these webinars, is just making educated decisions this year, not feeling based decisions. And that's really hard when you get kind of emotionally invested with some of your owners and some of your inventory. But it really could burn you this year if you did that.
Totally. I've got a good follow-up, but let's let everyone go and then I'll come back because I have an interesting question and I think everyone will kind of be able to answer on this one too. Javier, why don't you let us know what was going on in some or all of your markets, or kind of what you guys were seeing this year for the summer?
Yeah, so our summer isn't as big. Most of our the properties that we manage have a big Q1. The summer is mainly only in Orlando, but it was pretty similar to what Brian and Rebecca were saying. Initially, we shifted our expectations, I believe, back in February, March. We kind of started seeing signs that it was not going to be the same as it had in previous years. So we adjusted a little bit back then, but even that adjustment wasn't enough. We had to readjust by mid-May, again, the strategy for the summer. And we ended up with pretty good occupancy, but the ADR did took a big hit this year. But at least occupancy wise, we did pretty well. Another problem we have with the properties we manage in Orlando is that the property managers have duplicate listings. And so we deal with iCals, we deal with them managing other rates that are generally cheaper than ours. And so since around late April and early May, both listings were more or less empty in a lot of the homes. So what we did was basically just try and undercut the listing, so long as we didn't go below the requested minimum rates, just to get that occupancy to our listings. It's a big problem for us, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. Like I said, occupancy was on the higher end, so we did pretty good.
Perfect. Yeah. So far I'm hearing from some of the professional revenue managers, it really finding that right time to shift from prioritizing occupancy, usually at the expense and knowingly at the expense of ADR.
Yeah.
And then both Rebecca and Javier have mentioned that the adoption of that when you're working with homeowners was definitely very mixed. Jordan, what have you been seeing?
Very similar things. So we had lower expectations this year than last year, but it came in a little under. Same kind of thing where there was like a slump in the middle, but I think we recovered pretty good last minute, which was a little unexpected on the positive side. Similar to what everybody else has said, like there's a lot of pushback on rates. And I think that's one thing you have to educate owners or property managers about. If they're new, if they weren't around in 2017 and 2018, they really haven't seen a price sensitive market and are used to holding those ADRs. So now that we have, rates coming from the Fed and there's no more STEMI checks and student loans are starting back up, right? So now you're starting to see inflation and a huge crunch. And now people are price conscious again. So it's interesting in like the urban centers, right? We're seeing more demand occupancy wise, but also more price sensitivity because people have the option to travel there. They don't necessarily have to. And then I would say like our second tier cities outperformed expectations. So, like smaller cities, large towns, maybe neighboring a metropolitan area, those have like performed really well in our portfolio over the last couple of months.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I noticed something actually in early on in the year, in the ski season, where the second tier ski markets had done really well during COVID, and so they all jacked their rates up, and then, but not consistently, right? And what happened was this year, people just chose to go to other ski markets. They would like make the choice to go somewhere else. And a bunch of those people who really pushed their rate weren't able to capture that. So that concept that we kind of see as an early warning in the urban markets where you have a lot of choice. If you're planning to go to a city, you're usually willing to go to a couple if you're going to fly somewhere. The consumer like still deciding to travel, but being willing to change when and where they travel, I think is a really interesting component we have to consider in revenue management. As far as the follow-up question I wanted to ask, kind of based on what Rebecca was saying, and I think you all can kind of answer this, how far in advance, when you guys were noticing pacing issues, was optimal for the changes you think you were making in your portfolio for the summer? And if you didn't do it at the optimal time, when do you think was the optimal time to make some of these adjustments? Everyone's got that thinking face on.
I think it really comes to the dilemma of far out premiums. I think that is something that a lot of people really learned the hard way this year, and is really, I know I've advised my clients to rethink how they look at that, because we've had these inflated ADRs year over year, and then we're inflating the far out premium. Yeah, we all would love to get, those 30 to 40% ADR increases. Yeah, let's capture that Airbnb guest that doesn't know that the rates are going to change as soon as it gets closer. But the reality is the consumer is smart. Like, they know that for the majority of that. So if I actually get my ADRs only maybe 10% over what I got last year, and I can get in the groove and play the OTA game of getting more bookings, getting higher in the search results, winning, why wouldn't I do that? So I think that that's something that we've really been kind of helping our clients look at, how they're viewing far out premiums and what that kind of like sweet spot is for that far out premium, where you're not overpricing yourself. Because I do think that that's a big lesson that everybody learned this year. Ski markets learned it, a little bit earlier than some of the beach markets that saw it later in the year, but it was a very consistent trend across all markets of outpricing yourself too far out.
Yeah, I think like far out premiums are one of my pet peeves in revenue management. Like, everybody tends to use them, and I think they use them too much. Not saying they don't have a place or a time or portfolio, but people extensively use them. And I think it's more like a gambling technique. So they start their price high and then like slowly drop it lower and lower as it doesn't book. And that's just like gambling and like rolling the dice over and over again, right? But if you have market data or historicals, you should be able to ballpark where you end up. And if you know the rest of the market is doing this far out premium and slowly decreasing rates, then you can apply some game theory, right? And so you're like, okay, backwards induced logic here, like what would be a winning strategy? And most people are price takers in their markets, right? Most people don't have a monopoly or a large share of vacation rentals in their market. So you're a price taker, you're not really setting the prices. And so competitive positioning is important. What that means is that you can increase your conversion by having better competitive positioning, which is a higher rate in the beginning when everybody else has far out premiums, and is lower closer to stay date when everybody's dropped rate because they didn't book. So kind of like increasing your competitiveness and conversion early on, like where you would normally do a far out premium, a lot of times you'll end up with a higher RevPAR.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we saw that happen a lot during the Super Bowl this year. I think this has been discussed a lot during these roundtables, but it's a very good example of what Rebecca was mentioning just now, and the far out premiums that Jordan was mentioning. I think a lot of property managers were expected too much and didn't take into consideration how much the supply had grown in Arizona, Scottsdale, Glendale, and all that surrounding areas, which a huge miss. We have a property manager. I kept recommending, like, we need to lower now. We need to lower now. We're not getting booked. We're getting close to the dates, and it was, by the time we did, it was just too late because it happened like 2-3 weeks before the event, and it was still like 50% of the inventory was still available, and so that was a huge miss. And even though we saw the signs, sometimes we struggle a lot to convince some of the owners or some of the property managers that is the way to go. Even by showing them data, some of them are kind of like don't want to budge sometimes. But the signs were early on. I think January was very telling. In a lot of markets, January didn't perform as well as in markets where the high season is typically in Q1. January was a bit on. Miami, it comes to mind. Miami was pretty. It was good, but it wasn't anywhere near as it had been in the past. February, March ended up being really, really good, but January was kind of off. And so those were the early signs at the beginning of the year that maybe this year was going to be a little bit different and a little bit, maybe we had to be a little bit more conservative. So we shifted our strategy a little bit back then, as Bryant was discussing, like we started focusing a little bit more on occupancy, especially in the off season. And then as the markets started picking up, we adjusted again, but only for the high season. And then for the low season, we're now for the off season, which is most of our portfolio, we're focusing on longer term stays, and focusing on occupancy basically.
I think you bring up a really interesting point, Javier, because a lot of us, except for Bryant, but he has experience doing this, are working in multi-market kind of situations. So we have the benefit of kind of like seeing trends in some places and then asking a question like, is this something I should prepare for somewhere else? And that's why, it's partly why we're doing these revenue management roundtables. If you were listening to us in the spring, we had a number of people on who were managing Q1 high season markets, and they were talking about what they were doing in December, to combat their pacing that they were concerned about. And, it's, I think also why it's really important to, if you're in revenue management, have friends and with people in other markets, because you want to hear what they're doing. And because sometimes it is a canary in the coal mine. Sometimes it is just market based, but you do want to be able to be in a position to ask yourself the question, like Key Data has been putting out data saying occupancy is down for a while. When occupancy is down, you have to shift your perspective from ADR maximization to occupancy development, because if you're stuck in the last minute having to sell these properties, that there's plenty of choice for the consumer, and you have to guess at the rate that they'll buy. And that guessing is the difficult thing. We used to call it, I've always called it chasing the curve. If you're chasing the curve, like the demand curve is always changing and you don't really know where it is. And if you don't have data points, you're just guessing, right? So in a environment where potentially performance is going to be down year over year and you can't expect your historical data to be the best predictor of what's going to happen, you need to develop data points. And you do that usually by trying to maximize occupancy. Like occupancy is data points. I think we'll come back to this. I want to talk about that term base of business, because I think it's really relevant in an environment where you maximize occupancy first over ADR. We'll kind of talk about what that means. But Bryant, did you want to talk about that last question in terms of how far in advance?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on your inventory. Us being a primarily condo-based inventory, for us, we have a little bit more ability to influence last minute bookings than like Rebecca was saying, those 8-bedroom houses, those 10-bedroom houses that people are booking out there. When you're 1 to 4 bedroom condos, it's and when you make a good percentage of the market in those condos, it allows us to be a little more aggressive typically. But in terms of like what optimal for us was this year, I think making those adjustments in the spring, as we saw, spring not materializing the way that we thought it was going to, kind of making that call to, okay, is this just a spring issue or is this going to be an entire summer issue? Making the call there when we did it, I don't know if it was optimized. Hindsight's 2020. I know it worked for us to get occupancy. I don't know if we could have gotten some more rate if we had held out a little bit better on some of that. But, from our perspective, the way that we had to really go about this, and I've seen Rebecca post a lot about this, and I think this is a really, really good point. If you're going to make these changes like that in advance, communicating with your owners is such a key portion of that. Letting them know, candidly, here's what we're seeing. Here's why we're making the adjustments we're making. We're not just throwing darts at this. We know based on what we've seen, which is a good chunk of analysis by a bunch of people who know what we're doing here. Here's why we're making these changes. Here's why we think it's going to work. And that does help with some of it. Now, it doesn't matter. You're going to have in any inventory subset 10 owners who are just going to say, nope, don't care. You don't know what you're talking about. I know what I'm seeing. And so that's fine. That's fine. That's okay. Because the owners it's their inventory you're selling. So you will have an owner who says, I think this is what it needs to be. And that's fine. That's okay. But in general, as long as you're doing your best to communicate that out, again, this is the 80-20 rule. 80% of your owners are going to be comfortable with it. They're going to feel a little better about knowing that you were on top of it. And again, it's a lot easier to explain that we made these adjustments to try to make some occupancy and nights work out in a year where we think it's going to be down, than it is to come back right now after the summer's over and say, yeah, sorry guys, we thought it was going to hold, and it didn't. So
yeah, that's a great point. I do have one kind of little question that will kind of lead us into the next big pieces. What are we doing for the upcoming season? But something I've noticed quite a bit with people is they're thinking about summer for next year, especially if they had high season, is in their historicals, there's a bunch of properties that made reservations in like 2022 that were really, really high rate before everything switched. How are you setting your pricing when you have like some really high reservations that did really well, but then you know that the situation changed completely over the course of the revenue development? Like, I'm just curious how you guys are dealing with it, because it's funny.
It's so fun. That's what we're doing right now for 2024. Because that is a big thing that people are wanting to do, is get their rates out for 2024. They want to be bookable. They want to know that and John, exactly what you were saying. Like, you have these really high ADR. If you're looking at averages, you might as well just throw them out the window, like, because you have those unicorn reservations that came really far out. They're really, really high. And then you have the majority of your reservations that came last minute that were lower than probably what you wanted to. So historically, how we always would, look at setting rates is like, oh, look at kind of where my average was and add a little bit of an increase on it. And that's my minimum for next year. Well, that is not a good plan like for next year, because I like, we're looking a little bit more at medians. What is the actual middle? Like, how can we kind of reverse engineer where some of these units should have been, but then also looking at some of our clients that did get them down, but didn't have to get them down as much. And kind of using market data, seeing where the market started at, where the market ended at. It is a lot of analyzing. It's not, I think that there's no lazy approach for it. I think that as revenue manager, we want like a quick fix to just be like, oh, here's the rates for 2024. Here they are, they're done. But it's definitely a lot more in depth that you're going to have to look at. At least I am, because I don't want to relive that 2023 roll of the dice gamble. I'm not good at that. I don't like that. I like knowing where my budgets are, and I want to, if I'm going to drive ADR and I'm going to drive revenue and I'm going to beat our goal, I want to do that ahead of time. I don't want to wait to the last, in urban markets, that's different. That is the booking trend. They're, 2 weeks out. That's how they book. But some of those other markets, I don't want to repeat the same things that we went through this year. I want to take what we learned and apply it. And so I think it is being more strategic, and it is a lot more work, but in the long run, I do think that you're going to see a better result in getting realistic rates out there. And kind of like what we were talking about, just with those far out premiums, because especially your homes that suffered, okay, and you look at what you had last year, and it's like, okay, well, I don't want to build on top of that rate that it didn't book at. Like, that's not a good idea. Like, but I don't want to build off of something that I kind of basically gave away to get some occupancy. So it's tough on some of those struggling units, and especially in markets that are super saturated. It keeps revenue managers on our toes.
Anyone else want to speak to that?
I'll speak to it real quick. I think it's interesting because, like, you brought up basic business, and everybody just talking cancellations, and we talked about clustering a little bit already too. And I feel like all three are really related. It's like before, cancellations were really only a huge problem for multifamily because you had like interchangeable inventory. And so just like a hotel, if they see a cheaper price, it's easier to switch. But vacation rentals in destination markets didn't really worry about it in single family because it was like a one unique property. There wasn't a lot of options. Once you're booked, you're good. Nobody's checking your available rates. Now that we've seen like this inventory bloat happen in a lot of markets, like there are more options. And now that we see that occupancy isn't getting booked out in every market, right? Stuff's always open and people have more choices. And so now, even though you don't have identical units you can switch to, you have a lot more vacation rental options you can switch to. And so that's why if you don't positively yield and your rates come in too high, people just cancel and rebook. So I have a couple clients, actually I had one client I just onboarded and their cancellation rate this year is like twice as high as last year. So you just have to really be really careful on your rates and think about like timeline as a consumer, as a guest, as a traveler. What would I do if I saw these rates?
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I want to add to something he said there, because I think he had a really great point there when he was talking about, you know, the ability when there's not a full occupied market, you know, the ability to go cancel and find something else. I think that's a fantastic way to bring that up, because one of the things that we've seen across some of these industry articles and everything else is, you know, your high end properties this year are still doing okay. It's that kind of your middle of the road property that's, or your lower end one that's seen a lot more decline this year than, you know, the one that's that real premium, actually legitimate, you know, fantastic property. Because a couple things. One, like you said, if the market's not gonna fill completely up, the higher end properties are going to fill first, and they're going to fill for rates that are a little bit lower, but they're also going to have that initial book of business on from the early bookings, because people do get those things immediately, so they don't get taken before they get them, before they get what they want. So that's a really good point, that, you know, those higher end properties are the ones that, you know, you can use that opportunity to say, hey, you know, if you want to be this kind of property, here's what these properties are doing this year. You know, do you want to start making adjustments so that you can kind of perform like those higher end ones, so that as these downtrend years like this happen, that you're not impacted as much, you know. If you want to be the updated property that makes the adjustments and make sure that you're one of the first ones getting selected.
That's an interesting point. I talked to one client actually that, because they were in an urban market, and they were seeing, it was almost like the peak booking window was like 7 to 10 days, and then everything fell apart within like 3. And they saw, it's not that like we kind of looked at the data a little deeper, and it wasn't really that their sales pace stalled. It continued kind of consistent, but they started getting a bunch of turn within a few days. And what they did is kind of interesting. It's a little risky, but they actually increased their cancellation policies and made them more strict. But they did that along with lowering the rate plans further out, like all across the board. They're like, okay, we're not going to let people cancel like in this last minute, but we're going to offer, like, we're going to reduce all these premiums that we've been putting on, right? And that seemed to work okay. I think when you're playing with cancellation policies, you really need to think about that and test it, because the ramifications can be very complicated. But it goes back to that base of business, right? Like if you're looking for consumers, what I found in these markets is, you know, people keep saying the booking window is short, the booking window is short. First, ask yourself the question if the market is manufacturing that with their rates, first of all. Like, I found that often people are looking, but they're only looking within a certain price point. And if we have these consumers who are willing to look somewhere else or change their plans or stay somewhere else, they're just not going to purchase unless they see something that fits what they want. You probably always have properties in your portfolio where you can offer something at those price points. You may not want to do it with everything, but if you are able to find those properties that you can offer at those price points and they transact, you're now learning something. You're now no longer guessing. You're saying, oh, there are people booking. I just have to convince my owners or convince myself to stomach dropping the rate to this point if I want to take the risk or don't want to take the risk. Yeah. Anyway, Javier, did you want to speak on the kind of last point we were making?
Yeah, we don't manage like super high-end units. But yeah, I am in agreement, and especially the last point you were talking about, the cancellation policies. We typically play around a lot with that, and we typically have a more lenient cancellation policy on Airbnb than we do with the other channels. And of course, that kind of drives more business to Airbnb or from Airbnb than other channels. And we're slowly testing out ways to kind of have a more lenient cancellation policy on VRBO and Booking.com, but Booking.com is a little bit trickier because the cancellation rate is so high, and so we don't want to get to a point where what we were discussing, like people book a little bit far out, and then let's say we get a Booking.com reservation, but only to have it canceled within 2 weeks, and then not getting anywhere near close to the rates, and that translates to problem with the owners saying like, hey, why is your cancellation policy this? So it has been a struggle to kind of replicate the flexible cancellation policy. That even though every time we talk to the account managers at the OTAs, they're always saying like, hey, we still seeing trends that flexibility is still a thing. And when they show us the charts of the market, that is like 50-60% of the market still prefers to book flexible cancel policies. So we're right now looking into it, and hopefully we can find a solution towards the end of the year, because our plan is to basically start getting a lot more far out bookings and not depend so much on these last minute reservations. It's drives me a little bit nuts. It's very stressful. as a revenue manager, it's very stressful to depend on the last minute.
Yeah. I just keep like a 20-sided dice and I just roll for rates. I'm like, okay, 3 days away, like rates 20% off, 10% off. Going back to just the kind of like how to set the rates for 2024, I do have like one suggestion based on the ways I've been talking to people about this. Do a little digging. I think Jordan used the term clustering. I'll use the term segmentation. Segment your portfolio into different groups and use a couple data points to do that. You know, if you pull up all the reservations from, you know, the summer, figure out what units had average or median lead times that were like really far in advance that you knew were at the peak of your rate. Figure out which ones were like your core, like your best booking window. Like if you adjusted your rates, you were making a lot of good summer bookings in spring. Those ones are probably going to be the best. And then figure out which ones were last minute. And the reason you might want to do that is the ones that are booked really early, you might know that you might not be able to make that performance, but you also probably know that you don't want to have a conversation with an owner about why their rates are 30% lower now. So you might keep the premiums there, right? And then just write a reminder for yourself that like we need to have a more realistic conversation when we're able to have a more realistic conversation, like next January, and we can see everyone's prices in the market. But you may not want to put those lower rates out now just because, like, honestly, it's hard to have a conversation with an owner a year in advance and tell them that, even if you know, looking at the whole rest of the market, what happened. That middle group is like what Rebecca said, like use that to create as your baseline, right? That's your peak. That was like really solid performance. You can make some assumptions about how next year is going to change, but that's a good baseline for you. Then that bottom group is the one where it's like, okay, I have a lot of room to do better. So one, I can offer lower rates and actually get data points and build a base of business with these. Two, I probably should do better because these are the ones that we didn't react quickly enough on. And if I can shift them into that second group, get a little longer booking window, I should be able to do better. But chances are you're still probably putting out a lower rate on those. If you just use a few data points and segment the portfolio, you can kind of make decisions, and the answer may not be to just have one strategy for everything.
Yeah.
Cool. Anyone else want to comment on anything we've been talking about in the last couple of minutes before we move on?
I think what you said, John, about like manufacturing your own results is really important. And we see that a lot. So, you know, sometimes by clustering or segmenting, you can get like better read on data and tell a better story. But a lot of times people just kind of, you know, create self-fulfilling prophecies. And, you know, I've had clients on board and they're like, hey, we have last minute bookers. Like we get all of our occupancy in the last 2 weeks. That's just what the market does. And it's like, no, that's not what the market does. It's because you went half off 2 weeks ago. And like, that's what happens, right? Or like even at a market level, you can see it too, where they're like, well, this is like closer to stay date when it books. And you see the market drops rate by 10, 20, 30%, right? And you're like, well, it's because you're training the consumer. So like a lot of stuff happens like that with length of stay, with cleaning fees, with rates and occupancy. Like there's a lot of stuff that has confounding variables. And so if you're not careful, you create your own results. And so you just have to think like, is this actually what's happening? Or is this just what I've been doing?
Yeah. If you're going to be a revenue manager, just give yourself an existential crisis all the time. Do I know what I know?
I think
Awesome.
that's really important, just because, especially this year, if you see that the market is sucking, like in occupancy, and I'm beating the market. Like, am I really doing well, or am I just doing okay? Like, and I think that's the hardest part, is like having enough data points to really draw those conclusions to go, is this a win? Like, or is it not? Like, and I think it really comes back to internally, like, are you hitting your metrics? Are you hitting your goals? Really something that we focused a lot about is talking with our clients is not having an ADR perspective, but having a revenue perspective per month. Because if we are seeing ADRs drop, but we want to drive occupancy, I think people associate that to just like, oh, we're going to just make everything $100 a night, but it's not necessarily that. With added occupancy times that ADR, like you may make more per month than what you did last year at a higher ADR. And it's like, we've kind of had to draw that out for people to show them, like, it doesn't all, ADR is not the end all be all. Like length of stay, cancellation policy, fees, all of that goes into this, but we get so hyper focused on seeing a certain number on the calendar that really could be gypping us of really hitting those internal goals.
Yeah. You mentioned something that I think is interesting. I know Javier has a good story for this one. But what do you do when the market or the comps don't appear to be optimized to the consumer? So like you maybe are optimized to the market comps, but you don't think that the market's actually optimized for what's going on in buying behavior.
Yeah, for me, I mean, it's pretty, to me, it's very telling when you have your property sitting at 0 occupancy or very low occupancy, and you see the comps that you have also selected, which are pretty similar properties in a market very saturated, and everybody's sitting empty, then and you have similar price points. You've done the checks, like checked cleaning fees, you've checked that the total price that the guest will pay is more or less the same across the board. Then there's definitely something wrong. And demand is still there because you're seeing demand in the rest of the market, like 20, 40%, whatever. So there are people traveling to the destination. I'm talking specifically about Playa del Carmen in Mexico, in Quintana Roo. And so to me, and plus you have historical data of the property it was a property that booked a little bit last minute, but it was more or less booked at a 70-80% occupancy month in, month out, even in the off season. And so when I see that, we're clearly not priced to a price point that the guest is accepting at this time, at this point. And so that's where we come in and recommend to the owners, like, hey, this is what we're looking at. We're pacing way behind last year. We don't have anything on the books. Comps are sitting empty. Our recommendation is to be at the same level as where we were last year for the coming months. And that came after the owner requested an increase to the minimum rates, because Mexico has been going through their currency being very appreciated towards the US dollar. And so since we're pricing in US dollars, they were kind of getting hit a little bit because of the currency exchange. Or we were paying them in US dollar, rather. That's what was having a hit on them. And so they requested to increase the rates a little bit because of that currency exchange. We did it. They didn't follow our recommendations, even though I told them, I was like, hey, performance is going to be affected. We have last year's results. We were generating this amount of revenue month in, month out. If we do this, I'm afraid that will either performance will drop, or I never expected that performance to drop to like 0, literally 0. And so, no, but we need to do this. My costs of operating don't work. And I'm like, okay. So we ended up increasing the rates a little bit. Performance took a hit. 2 months after that, this was back in late March. So we were already going into the off season in Playa del Carmen. And then 2 months in, after very poor production, he asked for a second rate increase. And not only at the time, it wasn't only for the nightly rate, but he also requested a slight increase to the cleaning fees as well. And I'm like, his calendar at the time when he requested the rates was at 0% occupied for the rest of the year. It's like there was nothing on the books. Like, I'm not exaggerating. I know it's hard to believe that you don't have like zero occupancy, but we were completely priced out of the market. And so we tried again. It was like, hey, please review your rates. We have nothing on the books. It makes zero sense to increase our rates right now. There's nothing coming in. We ended up doing it. The good news is that 2 months after, he eventually realized that what he requested was wrong. And so now, 2 weeks ago, he agreed to our recommendations and provided full flexibility for the rates. We're starting to see reservations come in. That's the good part, but it was very hard to understand why make a decision like that. Like, why increase your rates when there's nothing on the books? It's like, I still don't understand why you would make a decision in that sense.
A lot of people don't understand the subjectivity of comps, especially in our space. And you know, you can always find someone who's priced a certain way, and people want to think aspirationally. But we were talking before we got on this. Sometimes it's, you know, like I'll respond to people. It's like, here are all the rates that haven't sold. Like, if you can see a rate that you're comparing me to, it is also not sold.
Yeah.
I think what you said, Javier, was interesting about like a situation where you might try to increase rate when you have nothing on the books. And I can't think of many, but I can think of one where I had zero on the books and kind of like raised rate. But it was because I thought the market had misjudged where we were going to land.
Mhm.
So it was like, it was a couple years ago in Austin, UT Notre Dame, UT USC football game, right? Huge national championship rematch.
Yeah.
Town was going crazy. The revenue managers didn't really have that much of an uptick because football games are drive to. It's like, you got to be really close. So they maybe boosted like 10% on rate. And I was like, no way, like this is going to be a national game, right? So we had rates super high. We were pacing behind market. Management team was asking me questions every day about it, why we weren't selling. And I was like, just wait, I promise it'll work out. And then they all sold out when the rankings came out in preseason. So everybody else sold out. We were the only game in town. I think we doubled or tripled the market average RevPAR that week. So that's like the only time I can think of when you would do something crazy like that.
Sometimes you have to have faith.
You just gotta know, man.
Or just a really big event.
a really big event, yeah.
Is that we actually saw that in Denver. I couldn't figure out one day what was going on, and I was like, oh my gosh, why did I just see like all of these reservations come in for July for Denver? And I'm panicking looking at everything, and then I realized after some Google that Taylor Swift was in Denver for 3 nights. And I am now a Taylor Swift fan because her concerts bring a lot of revenue and a lot of people that will pay some really high dollars to just be in her vicinity for 3 days. So, but it's, I mean, again, you're playing that gamble, but it's, you know, as soon as we kind of saw those triggers, we bumped everything up, and it was like, you know, internally they're going, we're not getting, this is summer in Denver. And I'm like, just trust me here. Trust me. Same thing with the Nuggets, you know, the basketball game, like all of those really big things. I think we learned stuff like Javier was saying about the Super Bowl, and being able to make those kind of pushes, but making sure that you're not pushing too crazy high, because those large events really can, you know, surprise some of those areas that aren't used to seeing that kind of movement or have that super big attention to it. But it is definitely something as revenue managers, you know, weather is another big thing. If there's, I hate to say this word because I live on the Gulf, but if there's that H word out in the water, like, you got to watch your rates and know your cancellations are probably coming. Even if there's a hurricane in the Atlantic, everyone that wants to come to the Gulf is canceling because they don't realize that it's 2 different bodies of water. But it's a lot of those like major events that you do have to really be conscious of, because it can swing your pricing really a lot. So, I mean, you have, not only are you looking at your market data, but you're looking at kind of national events, weather, all of these kind of crazy things to keep in mind.
You just remind me of one that's going to happen in Cleveland and in Ohio specifically next year. So we manage like 5 properties there, and there was a reservation that came in for, I think it was like early April 2024, and the rate was super high, and I was like, what, why? Like, I know the historical performance of the property, and the rate was completely out of how it performs normally. I was like, why is the rate so high? And so I looked in. Turns out there's a solar eclipse that the direct path of the eclipse goes through that city, and so the best point or the best way to see it is like in that area. So people are booking. This was back in May, probably, when the calendar is open for April. People are already booking almost a year in advance for that specific event. Good thing that the rate was pretty high already, but I did not have that. I would never have thought that somebody would book just to go see a solar eclipse. It was like, that was baffling to me.
Yeah. We are a little over. I'm happy to stay on for 4 minutes, but I don't know if any of you guys need to hop. So just wanted to let you know if you did. I don't mind staying on till 11:55, but just wanted to give you the opportunity if you were waiting. I think the key on these big events too, where the upper bound is unknown, is I think about a lot of this like kind of like risk management. It's like, set a cutoff date. That was what never happened with Super Bowl. They never set their cutoff date for like, okay, if I'm not doing this, like, I'm just gonna get people in at this point. Like, it's okay to really push for high stuff, but you kind of have to decide. It's like, okay, well, if I'm not, you can even make up the numbers. If I'm not 80% occupied by 30 days out for this at this rate, like, I'm going to adjust that. You can make different tiers too. It's like, if it's 60 days out and I'm at 30%, I'm going to start messing around with these rates. But whenever you have events like that, if you set some trigger points for yourself to say, like, should I be concerned right now? Because usually if you're going to wait till like the last day, you better be darn sure that the market is completely compressed. And you can check that. If the market's not completely compressed, you need to try something else, because the rate's not going to keep moving up in this industry. The other final tidbit is when I was at Stay Alfred, my revenue manager, revenue analysts were not sports people. None of them were. And so we kept missing events. And so I went and hired an intern at the college. I was like, I need the like broiest business administration sophomore I can hire. And his whole job will just be to tell my analysts what sports games actually matter. It was super effective. I highly recommend it to anyone who doesn't have a sports-oriented team and has a lot of sports games. Go hire an intern, tell him his job is just to talk sports. You'll have great results. Any final comments from anyone for today?
Yeah, I'd say, like, combining what you and Rebecca said about like trigger events and setting a cutoff for these unknowns and like big compression events, like I try to make them naturally occurring. What would make sense? So I have a few properties in a college town, right? And so their graduation sells really well. And so they sold really well historically. They think they can push rate even more, right? So let's try it. But they're like, hey, when do we know to lower rates? Like, should we be worried right now? And it's like, well, are people booking right now for graduation? Like, maybe they're waiting for Christmas for people to come home and talk about it. Maybe they're waiting for spring break when they can come home. You're making sure your student is actually going to graduate, right? So it's like, I'm not worried about it now, but if you see no movement by Christmas, might get concerned, and we definitely want to take care of it by spring break. So I think you just have to think about, like, when are people going to book this? And you can set that as kind of your reminders.
That's the art side of the revenue management.
And also something that John brought up earlier, like, you can do a test if you have more than one, assuming you have more than one unit, you can maybe not sacrifice, but try something different with one unit that is typically maybe the worst performer or whatnot. You don't necessarily want to do that with their best performer, and try it out and see how the market responds to that test.
That's the Ben Coleman revenue research bottom up right there. Brian, any final comments before we hop off for today?
No, just again, appreciate the chance to be in here and talk to a bunch of people who are really smart and learn a lot from you guys. So good to see you guys again.
Great to see you all too. Rebecca, any final comments?
No, I think it's just make sure that you're drawing your own conclusions from data. I think is really just the biggest takeaway. And if you don't know how to do that, find someone that does, that will teach you, because it's going to save you a lot of headaches, and it's going to save you a lot of, hopefully gain a lot of revenue to do that. But I think there is part of, as revenue managers, leaning into your intuition, and if something looks wrong, it probably is wrong. But it's nice to be able to check those with data and not just someone else on your team that also may or may not feel the same way that you do. So it's just good to find that resource.
Awesome. Well, appreciate everyone's time. Thank you to all the panelists. Always a pleasure to have a great conversation with you guys. This will be hosted, and you know, I know we don't get to questions too much on this, but I'll pull them out and we might find a way to maybe answer them in another format. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.